Are you a parent navigating the complexities of co-parenting, family court, or even domestic violence? If you are looking for ways to help protect your children and build a strong and supportive community around you, then look no further. Gray Minds Think Alike is your go-to resource for everything related to the complexities of family life. Join us as we dive into thoughtful conversations with experts and explore practical tips and strategies for tackling the challenges of parenthood in the throes of adversity so that no parent feels alone and every child's safety is protected. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Gray Minds Think Alike. Today, we are talking with Michael Volpe, a freelance journalist who focuses on political, police, corporate, and nonprofit corruption. He is also the author of Bullied to Death and Prosecutors Gone Wild. Hi, Michael. It's so nice to finally meet you. I know we've spoken briefly before, but I thank you for talking with all of us today and finding out a little bit more about what you do.
All right. Well, thank you for having me.
So if you want to just quickly just tell our listeners who you are and what you do, we'll start there.
Okay. So I started journalism probably full-time right around 2010. I've written I live in Chicago, so I've written locally for websites and newspapers nationally, like the Daily Caller, World Net Daily, and others. And then for the last 3 years, I created my own Substack, michaelvolpe.substack.com. And actually, there's 4 books. There's another book called Sandra Rucky and the World's Last Custody Trial and the Definitive Dossier of PTSD and Whistleblowers. And I do a lot of, I investigate many things, but definitely one of the focuses court in general, family court specifically, as well as CPS abuses, and also guardianship abuse. And in some states, it's called conservatorship. And I say guardianship is very similar to CPS, only for old people generally. But Britney Spears, who obviously is not old, that's an example of someone who isn't old. She was in conservatorship because in California, for whatever reason, they decided to use their own term. So I do a lot of that, and wrongful convictions. Those don't come along as often, but it's wrongful convictions and abuses in the criminal process is a huge problem. And I'm actually working on one that involves Sean Diddy Combs as well, because one of his accusers, I believe, was then later on wrongfully convicted of rape. So that's the kind of stuff I do. Right now I'm working on one where there looks like a legitimate rape or a rape with a lot of evidence that the local police refuses to investigate and prosecute. So the abuses go both ways. I think sometimes people are wrongfully accused, and then, as I said, in other cases, a perpetrator who did perpetrate the crime is being protected, as frankly in the case of Diddy.
Well, that's fascinating. How did you get started in doing that specific type of journalism?
So Initially, I was actually a mortgage broker when mortgages were hot, and then when it fell apart, I started blogging like in my spare time. And one of the blogs I did was on Emory University, and actually it was just I read an article about Emory and then I rearranged it. And the only reason it was interesting to me was my younger brother was going to Emory at the time, and then
my sister went there.
Yeah, very, very good school. Well, yes. What I read was that the medical school was abusing its relationship with Grady Hospital, which is the hospital there, and they have privilege. The medical students are taught not just at Grady, but primarily at Grady. Grady's massive, so it's like a boot camp in terms of learning medicine if you go to med school, and it's all poor people, so it's a lot of like emergencies because they don't get regular care, but when something goes wrong, they go to Grady because that's a public hospital, so they don't have to pay. And so Emory was abusing its relationship with Grady, and they would often leave the medical students alone there to treat the poor patients because the poor patients aren't going to complain, among other abuses. So I just wrote something very quickly. A former medical student named Kevin Koritsky contacted me after reading it and said, there's a lot more to the story, and we went through it. And I started writing specifically about that, not yet making any money. And from there, I eventually started to make a little money. I was still mostly doing mortgages. And from there, I met other like medical whistleblowers. And the way that I initially got involved in family court abuse was I then gained a reputation among whistleblowers in a variety of fields. And I did a lot of different whistleblower stories. But I received an email, like a press release from a group that was trying to expose I don't know what they call it, but CPS abuses in either Philadelphia or Pennsylvania. And it looked like an interesting story, and I got WND to write about it. I think it's something about no warrants, break down your door, and a lot of the people who I talked to, that was something like that, where CPS would show up, no warrant, they'd break down your door, grab your kids, no anything. And somehow this was allowed. And if you know anything, the reason that's allowed, and it's really not allowed, I interviewed a guy, Victor Eisler, who was the head of CPS in Forsyth County in North Carolina. And what he said is, we're on an emergency basis allowed to take a child for 48 business days, and then you have to go to court. And so it's not, the rules are always different state to state, but CPS isn't really just allowed to take your child for any reason and hold them for any amount of time. They have to get a judicial order. And there usually is a carve out, like if they believe it's an emergency, if they saw someone with an axe, they don't grab the kid and then go back later, but it's usually something like 48 hours. But there's all sorts of abuses involving CPS. So I did that story, and I think that story got picked up either by Alex Jones or somebody bigger. And so it did well. And then one of the people who I talked to for that story was Connie Valentine, and I think she's retired now, but she definitely was high level in the California Protective Parents Association. And I should note, even though protective parents, it's really primarily for women, which is okay. But Connie seemed to know a lot of stuff, so I wanted to do a follow-up that was interesting. And so I called Connie and I said, Connie, you're like involved. What are you seeing that's a really big problem that people aren't talking about, that someone should investigate? And she said, well, I think corrupt custody evaluators, that's a really big problem. That's what we're seeing. And at that time, I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what a custody evaluator was. I didn't know anything about it. And I said, okay, well, can you have a few people call me who had a corrupt custody evaluator? And so over the next 2 days, I had an enormous amount of people call me. It was probably 20, and I'd say 19 of them were women. And so initially I started to think, well, then that means that primarily women are being screwed. And I've stopped looking at that question because being screwed, like, it's very hard. Like, how do you measure being screwed? But eventually I talked to a lot of men as well. But primarily I do talk to women for a variety of reasons. But anyway, I saw that as an interesting story. And I took it to WND and they rejected it. And at that point, I realized there's both something here, because their rejection wasn't just no. They were like, don't ever bring us anything like this again. So there's both something here, but something that the media isn't covering. And on some level, I should have just let it go, because it probably wasn't going to be like a good career path. You should cover things that are easy to get published. But I also, one of the people I talked to, and ironically, a man, was Chris Macney. And the reason I talked to him was his custody evaluator had the same custody evaluator as several women. I talked to him a few times. The story involved Woody Harrelson, because his father-in-law had gotten involved with Woody's dad, and Woody Harrelson's dad was a contract killer, and his father-in-law had hired him to kill his business partner. There's all sorts of seedy things. And I talked to Chris for about a month or two, and I kept putting the story off because that was late 2013. The Affordable Care Act had rolled out. I had done a story that did very well over 1 million people, so it was more focused on that. And I just figured I could get back to it. And on December 29, 2013, Chris killed himself. And I knew enough about the story to know what his ex-wife would do, which would be to convince everyone that Chris was crazy. That's why he killed himself. And he killed himself because she drove him to the point where he had no money, no access to his kids, no way to get a job. and he was going to constantly be put in jail, and he lost his will to live. And I just felt a duty to tell the truth. And I tried it a bunch of different ways. I eventually wrote a book called Bullied to Death about his case, which includes a whole chapter on the murder, which is extremely seedy. And the reason the murder was important was Chris didn't know. And then he found out kind of by accident because he was Googling his father-in-law's name for whatever reason. And there was an article that popped up, and then he started questioning it. And the dad had built up this massive he got away with murder. In fact, he was convicted of accessory to commit murder, even though he hired Harrelson to kill his business partner. For whatever reason, what they convicted him of was accessory to commit murder, and he had built up this reputation. And I think he felt like, oh my God, my whole life's work is going to be destroyed if this gets out. And he had a lot of money. So he, in effect, was funding his daughter's divorce, and he went as aggressively as possible to not let Chris get away with anything. And that's how he lost his job, lost access to his kids, was jailed repeatedly, and was never going to stop. And so I even interviewed his former business partner's wife, his widow, I guess, his kids even. And it was a very seedy murder that Harrelson pretended to. He was a grain dealer. Sam DeJayla was the guy's name. But ironically, I started working on Chris's story. It took me over a year to write the book. And by that point, I'd made a lot of contacts. And so I just started doing more and more of these stories. One of the breakthrough was one that you find on Capital Research Centers called Making Divorce Pay, about the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts, which is a global trade organization for family court judges, family court lawyers. Anybody involved in family court. Outwardly, what they say is we do webinars, we do seminars, we do get-togethers, we have a newsletter. It's all good. We just try to teach people about the trends in family court. But underneath that, they push an agenda. And the agenda is several things. It pushes, for instance, the concept of parental alienation. But more than that, what it pushes is that you try to identify a problem, any problem will do, and then the solution is to appoint someone. And then that creates what I believe is a racket, because what it's pushing is for all of these people to look for problems and say, oh, here's a problem. Let's get a custody evaluator. Here's a problem. Let's get a parenting coordinator. And of course, all of these people that are being appointed, most of them are AFCC affiliated. So basically creates this racket where your job is to find a problem and the solution is to get someone else appointed. And there had been some things written about AFCC, not that much. And then it took off. I've been contacted, it's almost 10 years old now, by people all over the world, and they're all now looking to see if the people involved in their case are AFCC affiliated. So that one really took off. I did several that took off. The biggest thing I did was in 2021 when I got a Zoom conference that was put into a file of nearly 40 corrupt guardian ad litem in St. Louis, Missouri. And the reason the Zoom conference, the reason, and they're corrupt because they're on the Zoom conference and they talk about ex parte meetings with judges. They're gossiping about each other's cases. They're saying all sorts of unethical things. So the reason that the Zoom conference happened was one of the guardian ad litem, her name is Elaine Podlowski, she was being sued. And for some reason, the other guardian ad litem were very concerned about this lawsuit, even though they weren't being sued. If a cop is sued, other cops may feel bad. Oh, that sucks. I've been sued. It sucks. But you usually don't hold a Zoom conference to talk about this lawsuit and how it affects everyone because it's only one cop who's being sued. So they're on the Zoom conference and it goes for like 45 minutes. And as I said, and then the other thing that happened was this emailed newsletter called Daily Docket News that was written anonymously comes out to go after Elaine and other guardian ad litem, all from St. Louis County. And so the guardian ad litem felt under siege, like what's happening? At the same time, this has got to be coordinated. Now, no one knows who wrote the newsletter, which appeared for a while, disappeared, appeared again. Right now it's disappeared. Maybe it'll appear again. And it's only by email, and it's like not even invite only. you may get it in the email. Of course, you can forward it to others, which I do all the time.
Can I read it?
You can read it. I can forward you the email. But what it does is it's kind of snarky, but it details a lot of cases in St. Louis County, and it seems like only an insider would know the details that they write. So there's all kind of people.
Right.
Like it's either a lawyer, maybe a law clerk, maybe a paralegal who's writing it, and I don't know who recorded the Zoom conference because my source didn't record it. I'm certain my source didn't record it. So it went at least from who recorded it to and my source won't tell me. And I really won't try to get him to say it anyway because I'd rather not know. But that set off all kinds of, it was set off a chain of events. I don't want to say recruited, but I let my friend Megan Fox, who writes at PJ Media, who writes about these issues sometimes, know about the Zoom conference, and she watched it and she was enthralled. And I remember she called me. She goes, "Hey, friend." I'm like, "Hey," and she said, "You got to tell me more about the Zoom conference." And her reaction was more than I expected. So for about 9 months, the two of us, kind of as a partnership, and we did a live stream during it, would talk about all of the things that we'd found in family court, and it set off all kinds of chains of events. But what didn't quite happen is it did not penetrate the local St. Louis media, even though there's 40 corrupt guardian ad litem there. And so that was unfortunate. It did a little bit. It was covered by KMOV, which is a local TV station, but one story. The biggest thing was the St. Louis Record, which is the law journal, the legal newspaper in St. Louis. They covered it a lot. And then this guy, Nick Reed, did a lot. He was a radio host, but not even in St. Louis County, near it. But he did more than media in St. Louis County. And St. Louis County is right next to St. Louis, the city, but it surrounds it. So it's all the same, what would be called coverage area. So it didn't have the effect you'd hope, but it did have quite an effect. And the two of us, between Megan and I, got almost 100 judges to recuse themselves, probably 20 guardian ad litem from different cases. Over the course of 9 months, we exposed a lot of different things. We interviewed a woman named Liz Perkins, who writes for the Daily Express in England. She won an award for her coverage of British family courts. We interviewed Grant Wyeth, who it's global, but he lives in Australia. So we primarily in Australia, so an Australian journalist or a British journalist about what's happening in family courts in those two countries. This guy, Brian Ludmer, who's a lawyer in Canada. So we even started showing a global perspective on family court. And so that's probably the biggest story I broke and it's called the St. Louis Family Court Corruption if you go to YouTube. And it's pretty amazing, and you can follow it, even though you don't know any of these people, even though it's not meant to be followed by someone who doesn't know who they are. But It was a really big deal, but no one went to jail. Now, Elaine tried to be a judge, and that was shut down because of the publicity. Several laws were proposed, though none of them passed in St. Louis County. Now, laws have passed in other states that I think at least indirectly as a result of the investigations I and Megan and others have done. Primarily, I think there's 5 states that have banned the practice of reunification therapy. Reunification camps, not reunification therapy. And that's Utah, New Hampshire, Arizona, California, and I think there's one more state. So what reunification camps are, it's if the court deems that one parent is alienating the kids, they will force these kids to be driven usually out of state, but many hours away to a hotel for about 4 days, where they're just drilled in their head that the parent that you think is bad is not bad, and you're going to have to live with that parent. And it's a brutal, awful process, and it should be banned in all 50 states, but it is banned in now 5 states. Right, Turning Points is one. Family Bridges is another one. Now, what I found, what's interesting, there's actually a story, a lesser-known story out of Connecticut, same thing, where the mom refuses to let him do it, and then they jail the mom. Now, what I found, which is interesting, they still allow in all those states, in every state, what I'd call outpatient reunification therapy, which is more like 1 or 2 hours a week in an office, but it's not quite as bad as a reunification camp, but it's pretty much the same thing. And it's worse on one level in that reunification camps are 4 days, but then that's over. The brutal, horrible, traumatic for it is these reunification therapy can go on a year, 2 years, and that should be banned as well. And in California, you can still do like weekly for 1 or 2 hours a week reunification therapy. And I interviewed, I think she's 17 now. She was 16 when I interviewed her, Amelia Martinez, who went through this what you'd call outpatient reunification therapy, and it was all quackery. One thing is the therapist constantly refers to the court orders. The therapist is constantly coercing her into continuing therapy. Well, your mom's going to get in trouble. The court order says this and this, and if you don't do this and this, your mom's going to get in trouble. And and I'm listening to this, and like, therapy is supposed to be therapeutic. How are you coercing this girl into going to therapy? And look, the therapist can do it because it's court ordered, which is nonsense anyway. Court ordered therapy is never going to work because unless the person wants to do it, it's not going to work. So if you're forcing them to be there, especially someone under 18, it's never going to work. But the outpatient therapy is still allowed, but 5 states, and I believe over, the next 5 years, all 50 states will ban it. And I interviewed, she was 18 because she had just gotten out of it, but Victoria, she's called Tori Nielsen. She went through Family Bridges and she explained this all. That was September of 2023. In January of this year, they proposed SB 1372 in Arizona. This happened in Arizona. That would ban reunification therapy. She was the star witness at both the House hearing and the Senate hearing, or maybe it was Senate first, House later. It passed. The governor signed it. There's no more reunification therapy. And it was funny. She was the star witness. The Wall Street Journal has interviewed her in a written story. The Arizona Republic. No one ever mentions my interview, even though I did it before. So not given credit. And in fact, of the witnesses, I think there were 6 different witnesses. 3 I had interviewed. So I'll take credit for at least pushing forward the reunification therapy ban in Arizona. And now it's banned. But ironically, her younger brother, Marcus, who I think is 16, is still forced to live with his dad. The only reason she wasn't forced to live with her abusive dad is because she was 18. And that's why she did the interview.
She aged out.
She aged out. To say that her dad is abusive. And so she can do all these interviews. She can go to in front of the state legislators, and there's nothing anyone can do because the judge's mind is made up. I think the judge's name is Melissa Zabor, and that judge is an interesting judge. She's been on the bench maybe 3 years, and I've received over a dozen complaints about her. She's racked up all kinds of bad complaints in a very short time, and complaints like she ignores abuse, and that's the primary complaint.
And why do you think they do that? Just to make their jobs easier?
I think they do that because the system, if you will, runs better when the abuser gets custody. So why? Because if you give custody to the abuser, it's never fixed. There's this perpetual custody case, and you always have an excuse to get people appointed. The system works for the benefit of the players, and the players are the lawyers, the therapists, and the psychologists, and everybody else who gets appointed one way or the other, either to be a lawyer, to be a guardian ad litem, to be a parenting coordinator, to be a therapist. It works as long as the case is ongoing and it never stops. And if you have an abusive parent, then the child is never fixed. They need therapy. If you have the other parent is always fighting, so they're going to keep bringing it to court, and you're always going to find a reason to have that parent go through therapy and all these other things. And that's why sometimes
so it's never in the child's best interest.
Right, but it's in the best interest of the people who are in the system.
Making money.
You have these, you have these cases that go on 3, 4, 5 years, and you've got all of these people appointed. One of the people who I interviewed who testified was, well, I didn't interview him, but I did a story about him. He was under a gag order when I did the story. Was David Segee, who used to be a baseball player. If you're my age, you remember him. He played about 18 years. So his last contract was 4 years, $28 million. So he obviously had a lot of money. He went through it in Arizona. His kids went to Family Bridges, to Randy Rand, and a bunch of other things. Well, over 10 people were appointed, either a therapist, they called him best interest attorney, which is the equivalent of guardian ad litem. Over 10 people were appointed to his case at one time or another. I don't know how much money he spent. It was significant. Now, he eventually got his kids back because, again, having that big contract and a lot more money than the average person, he could continue to fight. He was eventually interviewed. What he tells parents is, if you're being screwed, speak out in court and keep doing it. And he said the hard part is you speak out once, and, the blowback's going to be huge and you're going to get scared, and you've got to keep doing it. And he did it for months and months and months, and they finally got scared of everything he put on the record, and eventually his kids were able to come home. And look, he has more intestinal fortitude. He also had more money. It's not as easy for everyone, but I think that is the right way to do it. And his ex sexually molested his kids. Both the kids said it, and again, he was accused of parental alienation. And by the way, David was married before. He has several adult kids. No one accused him of parental alienation with those kids. Did he forget how to parent? What exactly are you saying here? If he's a parent alienator, how come no one was saying this with any of the other kids and the other parent? Is this just unique to this one parent? But over 10 people were appointed to his case. So you allow all of these people to feed at their trough, or whatever you want to call it. I did a story with a guy named Gabe Shapiro, and he and his siblings started JPay, which is the email system used in most jails. So obviously he made a lot of money. And same kind of thing, a dozen people were appointed to his case, and just constantly having to pay this person and that person. And that's what they're doing. As I said, the system runs on you identify a problem. This is AFCC model, and your solution is always, well, because of this problem, what we need is this person to be appointed. And then that person who gets appointed, their job is to find a reason for another person to be appointed, and then that person needs to find another person. And the reason that works, so if you're good at getting other people appointed, then they owe you. So they're going to get you appointed, because you're going to stop appointing someone. If you've appointed them to 10 cases and they don't appoint you in any case, you're going to say, I'm not going to keep appointing you. I'm going to appoint someone who's going to get me appointed.
So it's all the more people, a political game.
Right. The more people that owe you, the more you're going to make, because now you've gotten 10 people appointed, they're going to get you appointed. And it's what Grant Wyatt, that journalist from Australia, called a corrupt market. And that's how the system works. I was speaking with someone at the beginning of this year, and they had a case out of Florida, and they said, well, my lawyer says I should get a guardian ad litem. And I said, look, sometimes it works. Every once in a while, getting a guardian ad litem works. But you should be skeptical of anyone who thinks the solution is to appoint anyone. That's the game. And this person told me they have money. And I'm like, it seems like what they know is that you have enough to spend. So they're going to get as many people appointed. They're going to keep telling you that the answer is to get someone appointed. And that's the game. That's the system. I call it a racket. Maybe it's legally a racket. In layman's terms, it's a racket. I think it's getting better now. First of all, the amount of exposure just in the last 5 years has increased dramatically. There are laws being proposed all over the place. The fact that they banned reunification therapy in 5 states is a huge win.
Which is really sad.
That happens. The Rucky girls, the case that I cover the most, which is out of Minnesota, where they were forced to live with their dad. They ran. They were hidden for 2.5 years. They were found before they would be sent back to their dad. They were sent to another reunification camp to, quote, break them. That came out at a criminal trial because, of course, their mom was charged with hiding them because there was a court order giving the dad custody. And if you know where they are and you aren't telling the parent who's supposed to have custody, then that's a crime. But they went to a reunification camp. This happens quite a lot. The first time I heard about it was probably like 2016, 2017, that there's such a thing as reunification camps. And now, let's say 7 years later, 5 states have banned it. And I think all 50 will ban it. I see a lot of different laws. You had Greyson's law. I see a lot of different laws proposed. They have in my opinion, varying degrees of effectiveness. This isn't a movie. This is real life. You're not going to fix something like, I don't know if you'll ever fix it because it's such a complex system. It's never going to work perfectly, properly every time. To me,
and I think part of the problem is that they need to take things case by case and not blanket everyone and say, this is the law.
I agree with that. I don't remember who it was who said it, but they said, child custody isn't cookie cutter. You have to take the facts of the case and apply it that way. But there are three problems, in my opinion, three broad problems. And so any effective solution has to fix at least one or hopefully more than one. So the first one is judges have too much power. If you fix it, you reduce their power. So one thing that I like, but I don't like that much, is making the custody trials jury trials. And that would reduce the power of judges. I just don't think it's a panacea, but that's okay. So the second problem is there's too much money in the system. So if you reduce the flow of money, that fixes it. And the third problem, it's too complex. So you simplify it. One idea I had was you eliminate all court appointees. So you make it illegal. So you would write a law that, and I proposed this in Missouri. I have a friend who runs a website where you can, as a citizen, propose a law. It would just wind up on a site. It wouldn't actually be in any kind of but it could be, then you try to get it to someone who would get it passed. But I would say in the state of Missouri, and of course you can copy the state, in the state of Missouri, in child custody, the case will be decided by the two parents, their lawyers, and any evidence they may present. The court shall not appoint a guardian ad litem, parenting coordinator, or any other third-party court appointee. And that's the law. You would then, number one, these judges, what they do is they use like a guardian ad litem or a parenting coordinator as a judge. They have them do a report, and then they say, well, the guardian ad litem wants this, so I'm just going with that. And you know what? The guardian ad litem should be the judge. Let's just make the guardian ad litem the judge, giving them this role. The second thing, it increases money, obviously, and it makes it more complicated because they're all advisory. So most of the time, they just take what the guardian ad litem says and they go with it. Sometimes they say, well, it doesn't matter. They're advisory. I'm just ignoring it. And so when do they ignore it? When do they not? And then what is their role? Can they write an order? Sometimes they claim they can. Other times, well, I have to go to the judge. So it makes it more complicated. You get rid of the court appointees. It stars the system of money. It makes it simpler. The other idea I had was you say that the trial at least has to start no more than, say, either 12 months or 18 months from when the petition, the original thing, is filed. One of the biggest problems, I followed this case, Christy Black and Max Black out of Orange County, California. They're on their 11th year. They're still technically not divorced. Christy has a live-in boyfriend for 5 years. They can't get married because she's technically not divorced. Right. You give it a year or 18 months, no more than 18 months, and then you have to start the trial, let's say. It doesn't even have to end, but you have to start the trial. And so that way there's an end, because what the lawyers and everybody will do is they'll drag it out so they can charge you. And then that starves the lawyers a little bit. So you don't have these scummy divorce lawyers who are counting on creating conflict to continue cases without end. So that's another idea I had. But I think those three things, if you resolve those three things, then you fix the system.
Do you think sometimes lawyers are
often lawyers are scummy. Defamation lawyers are scummy, but they're especially scummy if they're divorce lawyers.
Right.
You didn't go in divorce law because you have this idealistic, you went into divorce law because you heard divorce law is where the money is. And not all of them, I don't even know if most of them, but yeah, definitely. I got a great anecdote. There's a case I've been following, Jackie Sample and Madison Sample. And basically, Madison's a very well-off anesthesiologist, and they got divorced, and he moved all of this money away from their joint accounts into single accounts, and then they disappeared. And then he goes to court and claims, well, all we have is the house, which is worth $3 million. And it's completely ludicrous that you somehow managed to gain a $3 million house if you have nothing else. And the court's allowing him. And so I went to one hearing, and he has a scummy attorney named Matt Elster. And There's a dirty little secret. Lawyers almost always write the orders for the judges, even though the judge signs it and it's supposed to be the judge's order. Judges are lazy, so they let lawyers write their orders. So that's what Matt does. And it's not even, the bad part is that what Matt does is the judge will say A, B, and C, and he'll twist B a little bit to change it. And the judge will either not notice or not even care. But what the judge says the order should be is not what Matt writes. But I'm watching this in court, and they're talking about something. They take a break. Matt comes back. He goes, here's that order you asked me to write. So I see this, and then I won't explain everything, but we had to go from one courtroom to another. So we're walking from one courtroom to another courtroom, and I'm behind Matt, and I go, Matt, do you always write orders for judges? Man, is that appropriate? Can we talk about this? And I said it obviously to get a rise out of him. I didn't actually expect him to answer the question. Right. So he gets into the other courtroom and he immediately complains like a tattletale, like he's a kid in grade school to the bailiff. And he's like, that guy's bothering me. He's harassing you. You need to get him to leave. And that's the kind of stuff that these scumbag lawyers do. The other thing they love to do is to threaten lawsuits. I get cease and desist letters. I won't say all the time, but more than twice, more than 10 times I've gotten cease and desist letters. Usually they're from divorce lawyers, which is interesting because you don't know anything about defamation law, but they know that they make more money the longer that it goes, which means their real job is to continue the conflict. That kind of stuff, like cease and desist letters, but they definitely, what they do is they, not all, but a lot of divorce lawyers know that the conflict is where it's at. So they aren't working in your favor. That story I told about Gabe Shapiro, his ex-wife's lawyer, Dory Foster Morales, who was at the time the outgoing president of the Florida bar, this was all in Florida, she definitely created conflict. She definitely was telling her client, your ex is bad. So she was trying, I think there was 1 month where she charged $60,000 for that case. Think about how much money she was charging just for 1 month. So she was definitely trying to get her client to think that her ex is bad, that you need to fight for sole custody. They originally agreed to 50-50. She got it to sole custody for her client. Gabe fought back, and eventually the two parties, the ex-husband and ex-wife, talked without lawyers, and they went back to 50-50, which means that everything that happened didn't have to happen. They ended where they started, and if the lawyers hadn't gotten involved, then they would have just been at 50-50 the whole time. And so definitely there's a lot of scummy lawyers, there are a lot of scummy therapists. Look, anybody who does, for instance, a custody evaluation, that's all voodoo. You know that you don't really know.
It's all a show when they're
right, but I did a story out of Cook County, and these were two parents from Glencoe, which is a very wealthy suburb. And this guy did an evaluation. He charged $60,000, I think. I mean, it's ridiculous. All right. This is not as long as a book, and a book writer wouldn't make $60,000. So they're all scummy. And as I said, the goal is to get people appointed and to get that appointed person to get somebody else appointed, and it's on and on and on. And see, if you got rid of the court appointments, then you can't do that. I think that part would be easier. It's not always bad. And it's probably not even bad in more than 50% of the cases, but at least 15% of the cases, I believe, get corrupted and significantly corrupted. And look, I think the Center for Judicial Excellence has counted 800 children. Your son is one of them.
I went with them to Washington, D.C.
Right. That's the most tragic outcome, but there's tens of thousands of kids forced to grow up in abusive homes, tens of thousands of kids kept away from good parents for no reason. So the problem is not merely the worst case scenario, yours. There's, you're making a lot of kids who aren't whole, whose childhood is destroyed through terrible rulings. And if it's just that the judge got it wrong, that you can live with that because that's going to happen. These are complex things, but it often happens because of a lack of due process, because there's money involved. And I know one of your judges was involved in a case that I looked at. You had several, so there's not one judge who was responsible. One more than others, but
I believe there was.
No, there's more than one, but one more than most. I can't remember the guy's name, but he took a mother's custody time away temporarily because she wasn't wearing a mask in a doctor's office during COVID. It was like, if you're not going to respect COVID, then you're only going to have supervised visits. It was completely ridiculous.
And this was in Broward County?
Yeah. It was in Broward.
So was it Dale Cohen?
Cohen, yeah. Cohen did that to the other lady. And I think he did it to another woman. I interviewed one woman. I think I found another woman he did it to. He became like an ideologue for masks. The woman was in a doctor's office and took a photo of herself without a mask. And the photo was months old by the time Cohen figured it out. And he's like, you can't see your child because you don't wear a mask. Those kinds of things happen way too often. So the problem, I think, is widespread, but is it getting, I think the momentum is on the people who want reform, and it is happening. First of all, as I said, the amount of coverage of this is exponentially larger. The amount of people aware that the system is corrupt is exponentially larger. The amount of people who are then, as a result, more prepared for what's about to happen is exponentially larger. And laws are being proposed and passed everywhere with varying degrees of success. But when I first started covering this, there was almost no coverage, no laws being proposed anywhere, no one who thought there was a problem.
That's why I do this. I want to shed light because I get emails every day from all these parents that are just in the worst situations, and I didn't know how to help them because they came to me for help. And I figured this podcast was my way to give back by interviewing people that may have more answers, because there's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of flaws, there's just a lot of people that need help. I was looking at your page, and I was looking at the Kassenoff case, which I was familiar with, and I saw some of the things that you posted about it. I mean, that case is just so sad.
It's sad, but what I'll say is there's a few things. That case, Megan and I were, I think, the only people who interviewed Catherine while she was alive, and we did that interview in late 2021. You can still find that. The Free Press, which is on Substack as well, did a very long piece on that case, and they interviewed a lot of different people, and it sheds light. Catherine may have manipulated a lot of this, but that said, here's what I know. One of the problems with the case, as far as if you're looking at the family court angle of it, in New York, all of it is sealed. The family court is in New York State. So what that means is all of the information that you've gotten from both sides, both parents are selectively leaking the court documents that make them look good. You can't get the whole picture because it's blocked. So that's one problem. However, here's how the case went. Initially, Catherine went to get sole custody temporarily based on abuse allegations. Those went away. Then Alan went for sole custody based on abuse allegations. He got it. Then it went on an ex parte temporary hearing. Then it went to 50-50. Then again, Alan had sole custody. Now, there's no way the court worked properly if it went from one parent sole custody, another parent sole custody, 50-50, back to one parent sole custody.
Right.
There was a lot wrong with that case. The Mark Abrams I think he loves BTSM. He was the evaluator, and Catherine definitely exposed him. There were a lot of problems, but I think she manipulated a lot of things as well.
Sure. You never really know what is going on behind closed doors. And clearly, if they're going back and forth, sort of tit for tat, you have to wonder what exactly was the real story. The fact that she had to kill herself to get out of it is sad.
No, it's definitely a sad story. There's no question about that. She released a lot of videos that make Alan look bad. Eventually, there were videos released that make her look bad. And the reason that was happening was a therapist said, you guys should record each other. That sounds like a good idea. So be careful with that. Like my ex loved to record everything. Be careful of people who record everything. But that case, it is an interesting case. And I think there were definitely abuses in the family court process. And what I found was in that particular courthouse in Westchester was primarily men who used ex parte emergency orders a lot. And if you know anything about the system, ex parte, that means only one side is present. So the other side can't come back and say anything, that should be used for real emergency situations, because it's obviously
I filed one and it was denied.
And it was right, and yours was denied. And here they were handing them out like candy. And so it did seem like there was a pattern in that courthouse, not just in the Kassenoff case. I found several other cases where the men were using this ex parte emergency process. They were misusing it. That's one problem. This guy Abrams was another problem. There were a lot of problems that I found in Westchester County. However, if you're interested in the Kassenoff case, definitely read the article on the Free Press. I think it's THEFP.com, and then you'll have to search for it and do Kassenoff, because they did an in-depth interview. They not only interviewed Alan, they interviewed maids, other people. And there was a lot of things that Catherine didn't say that happened that other people saw happen. So I'll say that. But
so how is a judge supposed to make a ruling if both parents are lying?
Well, Well, look, that was the point I made. Is it seems like, a lot of people, I put up some of the videos that made Alan look bad, and people said, it looks like both parents. And I'm like, well, that might be. So how come only one parent got sole custody? How did it work out this way that only one parent got it? So that seemed to be where the process was being abused. The courts put their hand on the scale and take complicated situations and simplify it. And then in other cases, I think in your case, what should have been a simple case that there's abuse, there's clear evidence of abuse, and they make it more like, oh, it's complicated, we're not sure, we need this, we need that. And always the end result is a lot of these court professionals are making money.
Right. Yeah, it's all very sad and shocking. And like I said, I was looking at your Facebook and your website and all these fathers' rights movements, which I firmly believe in fathers' rights, but there are a lot of issues there because I believe they are blind to see what's reality.
There's a difference between fathers' rights, the general sense. I'm a father. Right. Of course, I believe in fathers' rights. And the fathers' rights movement, which is a specific movement that bolsters fathers. And the fathers' rights movement believes all women lie and no man ever abuses.
Which is obviously not true because my son was murdered by his father.
Right, of course. And look, the feminists believe no woman lies and every man is abusive. And of course, you can't have absolutes like that. Believe no woman is as stupid as believe all women. And every day, I don't know who I dislike more, the fathers' rights movements or the feminists. The fathers' rights movement definitely bolsters abusers because they believe all women are vindictive and that when the relationship breaks, the woman's job is to keep the child away. And this is what they believe. And they create a caricature of women that may apply to certain women, but it doesn't apply to the entire gender. There are as many bad women as bad men, so it's not a matter of gender. But they
of course it goes both ways,
right? But they caricature women, and then men is always the hero. As I said, child custody isn't cookie cutters, so to do it that way is definitely wrong. They perpetuate all sorts of stereotypes that help abusers create these cookie cutter cases. They are for 50-50 as the standard, which I think is just completely asinine because I don't think that in any given case that 50-50 is better than 60-40 or 75-25, and that you do have to look at the facts of the case. One of the reasons they want 50-50 is because in most states, not every state, but in most states at 50%, no more
child support.
50-50.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. It's always nice to get not only a male perspective, but definitely someone who has been inundated in this genre and this field and knows about what is really going on behind closed doors. So I thank you for coming on and speaking with us. And hopefully we cross paths again.
Anytime.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Michael.
If there's someone that you want to hear from on this podcast, please feel free to send me an email. Or if you would like to be a guest, please reach out at Allie@graysonschoice.org.
If you'd like to continue to hear our podcast, please consider donating at graysonschoice.org.